Hey there, I'm Gray Estrada, Chinese medicine lifestylist, face reader, podcaster, educator, and artist. This is a quick crash course in face reading. So what is face reading? It's one of the numerous classical branches of traditional Chinese medicine. The two branches that are known the best in the West are acupuncture and herbalism. Here are some key ideas. 1. Form and function relate. A tiger's teeth and stripes point to a carnivorous diet and camouflaging with its environment. A monkey's long limbs and a light body point to agility while moving through the trees. Because humans are a part of nature, the same rules apply for us. Variations in our facial features points to aptitudes, talents, personality traits, and aspects of our physical and mental health. 2. Facial color and appearance relate to health. When someone has jaundice, their skin and eyes turn yellow. When people don't get enough sleep, they get dark under the eyes. Chinese medicine stipulates the colors on the face are indicative of various organ functions and is considerably more complex and nuanced than what's understood in Western medicine. 3. We all instinctively face read. Look at these photos and tell me which person you think is the ex-Navy SEAL and martial arts expert. Have a guess yet? If you're like 95% of the people I show this to in my courses, then you pick this man, Jocko Willink, who is indeed an ex-Navy SEAL and black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The question is, why did you pick him? Because people's bone structure, muscle tone, coloring, wrinkles, and facial shapes all clue us into people's dispositions. Face reading is practical, and it's a skill that can be and should be developed. 4. Face reading is a form of profiling. The FBI and forensic scientists analyze handwriting, known as graphology, to assess and capture criminals because people's handwriting points to personality traits. Law enforcement and psychologists read body language to figure out if someone is lying or telling the truth. Face reading is simply another way to assess our personality, emotions, and experience. 5. Face reading is about pattern recognition. Chinese culture was excellent at documenting patterns observed in life and nature. These observations were recorded and passed down through hundreds of generations. Fast forward to modern times, and the Chinese have accumulated thousands of years of fascinating data relevant to the open-minded and modern human. It can't predict one's future, but does aim to identify rhythms and patterns in your personality that support your intrinsic nature and optimize the direction you take your life. 6. Face reading is relative, not absolute. It is not psychic fortune-telling. It's not about strict, definitive answers about people and their experiences. Acknowledging this keeps face reading humble and realistic. It's about assessing one's features in relation to priorly documented data and attempting to find relative patterns that can support the complexity of a person's aptitudes and experience. Face reading is indeed fallible, but that doesn't make it irrelevant. 7. Public persona and interpersonal nature. Chinese medicine relies heavily on yin-yang theory, which in a nutshell is the theory of polarities and opposition. Some examples are birth and death, men and women, night and day, hot and cold, expansion and contraction. This means the left and right sides of the body are said to carry their own polarity. In the context of face reading, the right side of someone's face relates to their public persona or extroverted nature, while the left side relates to their interpersonal nature or introverted nature. Terms and definitions: Jing, Qi, and Shen. These are known as the three treasures in Chinese medicine. It's said that if you guard these well, it ensures a life of health, longevity, and emotional resiliency. Jing relates to our genetic expression, bone structure, stature, how well we age, sexual vitality, and the talents we inherit. Qi relates to the energy we yield from the quality of our breathing, eating, feeling, thinking, and sleeping. Qi is not a mystical energy that allows telepathy or telekinesis. The closest and most modern definition of Qi is bioelectricity. Shen relates to the consciousness, anima, and personality of a person that can be seen, felt, and experienced, but not quantified. Mountains and rivers. This is a lens within face reading where we think of the face as a geography or landform. The areas with bony protrusions are mountains, and the areas containing moisture are seen as rivers. The mountains are the forehead, nose, cheekbones, jaw, and chin. The rivers are the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Assessing the mountains and rivers of a face points to a person's most ideal geography to live in. The 5 elements. Fire, earth, metal, water, and wood are seen as 5 phases or rhythms in the natural world that mankind has been dependent upon since the beginning. They are seen as non-self-aware personalities and/or the emotions of planet Earth. Because we're an extension of the natural world, these rhythms can be found in us in relation to our organs, emotions, activities, and facial features, amongst other things. Some people carry more of certain elements than others, but we all carry some of each. Enjoy the face reading. Welcome back, everybody. We've got another installment of the face reading series today. If you guys are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Gray Estrada. I'm a Chinese medicine lifestylist, and part of what I do is face reading. It's the way I work with my clients is I read their faces based off of this classical branch of Chinese medicine, and then I build out their lifestyle guidance around their face. So everyone's face is unique, just like a thumbprint. So welcome to the channel. Like I said, if you're new, and today this is a little different. We're going to be doing the first serial killer that I've ever face read, at least in a public form. I've read many serial killers' faces personally, just to understand pathology better, and that's kind of what this is about, is looking at Richard Ramirez, who was known as the Night Stalker. I believe his killing spree happened in 84 and 85, and then he was caught in 85. But again, it's not particularly enjoyable to read someone like this. I think it's easier on me to read someone who's lived a happier and healthier life, but pathology and toxicity and these kinds of things are a part of life. And I think if we can understand that, we can navigate life a little bit better. We have to understand what pathology looks like. And I think it's just good gung fu to have a good eye for these kinds of things and to look for patterns, facial features in people that could potentially be dangerous, could be killers. So we're going to start with the Jing, Qi, and Shen layers. And when we look at the Jing of Richard Ramirez, it's not collectively great. And part of this, yes, people that take life, that are killers, that are aligned with the spectrum. Jing is about longevity and how our genes express into the fabric of life. And for someone that takes life and that was this murderous and violent, we're going to say that, from the get-go, there's a problem in the Jing. There's a problem in the genetics. So first and foremost, that's not great. His Jing is not particularly strong in that regard. Now, he does have a very prominent bone structure. If you look at his bone structure, it's actually quite unique. But that's not the only signature of good Jing. Good Jing is also about countenance of spirit. It's about how we live, and it's about our bone structure in relation to our individual life force and our personal energetic signature. It's how these things relate and blend that makes the collectively strong Jing in a person. Now, he did die of B-cell lymphoma, and ultimately he died of liver failure, which is interesting to look at through the context of Chinese medicine. So if we look at Richard Ramirez dying of lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, and ultimately his liver gave out, and I found a bunch of articles actually where it said his last days, like 2 days, he was bright green, like a green highlighter pen. His whole body was just green. Now, when we look at face reading, you guys have heard me talk about this, colors on the face and colors that show up on the body mean something. Interestingly enough, the liver relates to the wood element, and the color associated with that is green. Green is the color that associates with liver energetics. People that get green in the face, or the people that are about to be vomiting sick, they'll turn green. They'll get that greenish hue. Now, we see when there's liver problems, sometimes we see jaundice where people turn yellow. But there were a number of these articles saying it was just so abnormal that he turned bright green before he died. And when we look at that through the Chinese medicine lens, what that means is, my sense is, what his liver is what ultimately gave out and what ended up killing him. The liver processes anger at the toxic level. So all of the organs process a positive and negative emotion, vigor, and what you would call enthusiasm, and that gusto to chase life and chase your dreams. That's regulated by the liver. That's the positive side. The negative side is anger and rage. And it was very well known that Richard Ramirez had very real problems with rage and anger. And for that to be the thing that took his life makes a certain amount of sense. One thing we have to understand when we look at Chinese medicine is that Chinese medicine sees blood as a liquid tissue, and that the heart, which is the seat of all consciousness, okay, where the emperor sits, every time our heart beats, right, it does this bum, 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 bum. The heart is imprinting emotions, stamping emotions into the blood. And that is part of how the emotions circulate through our body. It's part of it comes from how the heart actually stamps emotions into the blood. So the Chinese have this very real, in-depth understanding in the clinical context and in theory that our emotions are stamped into our blood. And given the emotional terrain of Richard Ramirez, it makes sense that over time, what his heart was putting out, the weak link was the liver, the rage and the anger. So that's just an interesting side note. Now, if we look at the qi level of his face, he is pale. He is what we would call blood deficient. He's also yin shu, which means yin deficient. Now, yin deficiency means naturally the fluids, the things that yin is what you would call the kerosene in the lantern, right? It's what gives life. It's what allows the flame to actually stay on. When we look at him, he has an emaciated look, okay, pale, blood deficiency, which means that the state of his blood, okay, the state of his emotional train is not doing particularly well. Now, if you look at Richard Ramirez, his diet, what he ate, what he did, it was horrible. He would eat just buckets of candy, processed candy from liquor stores, would drink Coca-Cola, and then was doing a lot of drugs, was doing cocaine and was doing a mixture of different things. He was, partaking in LSD, he smoked a lot of pot. So you put all these things together and you've got someone who the chi they're producing, okay, the vital energy that comes from the food, air, and water and the thoughts we think and feel, that's what produces our daily vital energy. What he's putting in and what he was naturally experiencing wasn't good at all. So we can see it in his face, this washed out, hollowed out, emaciated, pale look. Looks like a ghoul, in short. Part of that was diet and part of that was emotional terrain. If we look at his Shen, what we're seeing is what I call poisonous fire. So he does have, when we get into the 5 element section, we're going to talk more about this, okay? But poisonous fire, which is the Shen is the fire, right? It's the thing that gives off light that permeates a room. His Shen is collectively poisonous, and his face and his bone structure actually aligns with the archetypal symbolic imagery of demons that we've seen in other, world traditions and other lore. He looks like a demon, and that's really interesting to note. There's nothing welcoming about his face. And if you look at this picture where he smiles, which was very hard to find him actually smiling, this is one of the ways Chinese medicine, especially in the context of face reading, says, look at a person's face when they smile. How do you feel when they smile? What does that smile convey? Because when a person smiles, their spirit is very light and it lights up. And so you're looking at basically someone's best side when they're smiling. And so a telltale sign is if someone's smile makes you nervous, something about it makes you fundamentally uneasy, that means you're seeing their brightest light, and that brightest light is likely not particularly great or good. And so I definitely see that with Richard Ramirez. Now, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about Jing here, because there are some things that really paint the picture as to how Richard Ramirez went down this road. So when we talk about Jing, Jing is about the genetic expression. So it's definitely about the lineage that came before us, what we inherit from our parents, absolutely. That's what we would call the prenatal energy, right? Before we're actually earthside. What happens in utero, the genes we get. Then those genes are expressed in what we call postnatal energy, the daily life we live. Once we're earthside and we breathe and we're no longer in the amniotic fluid, we have to make our own energy. And our Jing can continue, okay, our constitutional essence can continue to be nourished as we get older. What's really sad about Richard Ramirez and with a lot of serial killers is you can see the context of their life. He was the recipient of a lot of physical and emotional abuse from his dad. So his dad was very violent, had a very, very bad temper, and was very abusive to Richard Ramirez. And then Richard Ramirez's cousin, a guy named Mike Ramirez, who apparently was, I think he was an ex-Green Beret and served in the Vietnam War. He was close with Richard, and around ages 10 to 13, I believe, they were very close, and he brought home from Vietnam pictures of this guy, his cousin Mike, had brought home pictures of him torturing, raping, and murdering and beheading a number of Vietnamese women. And this guy had a shoebox of pictures, and he was showing it to this very young Richard Ramirez, which is just a horrific thing to even think about. So when we think about it in the context of Chinese medicine, you've got someone in your Jing lineage, someone who's genetically related to you, passing down this poison. So Richard Ramirez already had a proclivity towards this. His bone structure, the violence tendencies, I mean, you can see it. And apparently his cousin was also, a murderer. It was already in his Jing. And then, so, while in utero, those genes are circulating. He comes into the waking world and it's fostered, it's nurtured, which brings us to the whole question of nature versus nurture. And this is something that's really, really horrific to think about. As I researched it, it just turned my stomach. And when he was 13, this guy, Mike, ended up shooting his wife in front of Richard Ramirez when he was 13. And from that point forward, they said people said Richard Ramirez really withdrew and was already an introverted loner, but became even more so. Never talked about what he saw, didn't go to the police, didn't do anything. When he was convicted and caught later, he ended up telling the story. And, it was definitely a piece, I think, to what contributed to his toxicity and how he lived his life. The other thing to look at here, okay, and this kind of ties back to the video I did about Aaron Hernandez when we're talking about brain injury. So very common for a lot of serial killers to have brain injury early in life, to have head trauma, which makes them collectively, quote unquote, meaner. This is a very common thing that happens to people where they get hit in the head when they're young and they develop aggressive tendencies. It's part of the brain injury. Richard Ramirez, at 2 years old, had a dresser fall on him, and he had to have 30 stitches, but a full clothing dresser fell onto him and split his head open, and it was a really severe head injury. 30 stitches, and then when he was, I believe, in his early teens, or he might have, somewhere in 12 in that range, he was at a park and a swing, one of those heavy wooden swings, was at full tilt, hit him in the side of the head, knocked him unconscious, and he had seizures for a number of years after that. So again, right, it's like the perfect storm of someone who's already genetically predisposed to maybe violent tendencies, and then it's exacerbated by head injuries. The reason I'm bringing this up in the context of Jing is that Jing, okay, what they call the sea of marrow, all of our kidney energetics, the brain, is seen as like the surplus or the infrastructure for our genetic constitution. So inside the bones, the marrow is seen as like our deepest reservoir and also has very strong ties to our genetic expression. So to take a brain injury into what they call the sea of marrow in Chinese medicine matters. It means something, especially at a young age when your Jing is naturally expressing. So again, a perfect storm, really horrific and sad, but it's what it is. So we look at his prominent features, okay? The eyes and the cheekbones are the first thing that leap out. Penetrating, toxic, dangerous looking. There's nothing welcoming about this guy's face. Now, a close second, I would say his jaw and his chin. And we're going to talk about those features and what they mean when we get to the 5-element cycle. But these are the features that leap out the most. And what's interesting about Richard Ramirez is that actually he has, for not having much earth in his face, he has a very earthy mouth, which means it's plump, it's full. Technically, it's his luckiest feature, but the context of his features ruin it. And this is the thing I'm always trying to tell people when they're looking at face reading, is that you have to read the features in relation to the other pieces on the face. So, sorry you guys for the dog barking. I'm at my mom's house. But the thing you have to look at is, you can have a good feature, but if the other features dominate it, it doesn't really matter. And then you have to look at that lucky feature as something now potentially toxic, because all of these other features are going to change the expression of that quote unquote lucky feature. So with someone like this, with Richard Ramirez, when we look at his mouth and we see that full mouth, this is technically what we would call a lucky earth mouth. Someone who likes, they're sensual. They like the pleasurable things in life. They like soft textures. They like good food. They like hanging out with friends. There's something sweet of house and home about it, but it's about pleasure usually. It's about the senses, enjoying the senses. And you put that mouth on this face, you've got someone who enjoys killing. And that's a really sad and twisted thing to think about, but it's a reality given what we know about his history and the amount of murders that he committed. So outside of that, usually this is the spot where I would do the interpersonal nature and public persona, but you guys, I could not find a straightforward picture of Richard Ramirez without a really strong facial expression or his head tilted up to one side or looking over. I just couldn't find it. So I couldn't really do an interpersonal nature and public persona. I also think in the context of Richard Ramirez, it doesn't really matter because collectively, his face reads so harsh and so toxic when I look at him, I was just doing my hand up, and closing one eye and looking at both sides. They both read bad. I mean, neither one of them are welcoming. Neither one of those faces are one that you would want to sit down and have a beer with or leave your children with. Like this, like I said, it kind of doesn't matter. With a face like this, I mean, I hate to say that, but it just doesn't matter. So the thing that I'm going to kind of put in place of this is something called the death mask. Now, this is a concept in face reading when we see the hollowed out cheeks, okay? The more skeletal and more hollowed out a face looks, this is what we call the death mask. Now, when we say the death mask, it's not reserved for serial killers. It's not inherently even a bad thing. Many prosperous people have what they call the death mask, but they have other features that balance it out, and it can actually be a good thing. But in the context of Richard Ramirez, given his features, his eyes, I mean, the whole picture, it's not a good thing at all. So the death mask is usually someone, okay, if the cheeks are hollowed out, we see it in Iggy Pop, we see it in a number of people who have partaken in heroin or heavy drug use. Their faces get really hollowed out and kind of skeletal right through here. And this regulates the immune system, the cheeks, the fullness and the plumpness of the cheeks. So when we see this, okay, the death mask, what this means is a person can oftentimes have a very real and strong death instinct, which means they can sometimes be engaged in risky behavior like drugs or rock climbing or doing something like that. And it can also mean if the other features don't predispose them towards those kinds of behaviors, what it also means is that they can have a very keen eye for the spirit world and the material world. People that go into shamanistic work can actually have this feature. They can have hollowed out cheeks and they can have this sunken look in the face, and it's not a bad thing. It actually means they have one foot kind of in the spirit world or one foot in the material, and they have a nice balance between logic and intuition. Not a bad thing. But again, on his face, it's not great. Not great at all. Like a very unlucky feature to have in addition to everything else he's got. So he has a very strong death mask. His features look skeletal. And like I said, looks demonic, skeletal, and hollowed out at the spirit level. Now, when we look at the 5 elements of his face, okay, this is what I would call toxic wood and metal. In the 5-element cycle, all the elements have a creation cycle and a destruction cycle. And some elements foster growth into the next element, like water nourishes wood, but then they have a destructive cycle, all right? So like water destroys fire, for instance. And in the destructive cycle, metal destroys wood. We think of an axe chopping down a tree. This is the same thing. So when we look at this toxic metal, two conflicting elements, but the features are very dominant, which means you've got two elements that technically, one destroys the other. But if you look at his cheekbones, these huge prominent cheekbones, which are a metal feature, okay, very sizable cheekbones, very dominating. People with the big cheekbones, typically, like I've said before, are sort of like the bossy types. Bossy isn't bad, just means they need to be in charge. But when you've got this kind of prominent cheekbones with these other really sharp toxic features, you've got someone who has a very dominating energy, who's willing to likely be highly aggressive. And then he's got this incredibly cut, chiseled jaw, excessive. So if you look at this picture where he's looking up, you can really see, the sharp angularity that comes out of his jaw through here. And then if you look at these pictures, I can cycle through a couple of them here, really cut and chiseled jaw, which is a wood element feature, but this also means people that are highly driven. This can also be people that are highly aggressive. The more cut this is, you better hope that there's some features there, some watery, softer, plumper features that are going to balance that out, because you put that jaw and you put that chin and you put these cheekbones on eyes like this and those hollowed out cheeks. You can really start to see it, especially in face reading. It's interesting. You can just see how it's the perfect storm of toxicity. He has very little earth. So earth is about plump features, soft features. The only thing that he's got that's earthy is his mouth, which means no sweetness, no tenderness, no of house and home, no good diet, no good food. Like it shows here, like his earth is very weak. And the only earthy feature has is the mouth. And like I said, that's pleasure seeking to a degree. And you've got these other features, and you look at his life, took pleasure in killing. So his mouth in this context is not lucky. And if we go to the mountains and rivers, okay, like where he would live, right? This is kind of interesting, because if you look at his face, the topography of his face, you look at that as a geographic terrain, you're looking at an isolated, desolate, cold mountain range. You're looking at sharp, jagged mountains that are dry, that don't have anything around. His face has he looks like a jagged mountain that is very treacherous. There's nothing conducive about his face that makes you want to go and take refuge, to camp out on his face. And so interestingly, when we look at his face and we look at the features in relation to the mountains and rivers of where he would be guided to go, what his face looks like and where he should actually live would be this isolated, desolate mountain range where there's not many people around. That makes a certain amount of sense given his violent tendencies. This was not a people person. And for someone to live in a place like that, to be removed from society, might have been a good thing. That solitude might have been his saving grace. We'll never know, but it's very possible that it could have been. So for his mountains and rivers, that's the primary things that I see with him. And then, this was tricky, you guys. Lifestyle guidance, providing lifestyle guidance for a serial killer. Not the easiest thing, right? And it's hard to say. With someone like this, the nature versus nurture, coming in with violent tendencies, being nurtured the way he was to, continue that violence and to continue to move forward. it's really hard to say if any of these things would make a difference. But the thing that I would have said, if I had gotten to Richard Ramirez when he was a young boy, was, he needed an earth lifestyle, which means sweetness, tenderness, loving support. His mouth and his face was deficient in earth, but that mouth was basically saying that he could really use a loving support, and we all do. Okay, so that's not just to say that because his mouth is like that, he's the only person that needs it. We all need tenderness and loving support, but it would have been really critical for someone like this with these facial features, given that the proclivities for them to be even more aggressive are very real. So that earth lifestyle of just being tender and loving and supportive and sweet and of house and home and of quality food would have been so paramount for a guy like this. It's important for everybody, but oh my God, for someone like this, absolute necessity. Now, given his jaw, that squareness of the jaw and these cheekbones, this guy would have needed a ton of physical activity. I'm talking hard manual labor, day in and day out, every day. Something to move that liver energy so that he could just be working his body and get that tension and that stress out. Because this man, in reading his story, was incredibly emotionally repressed, incredibly emotionally damaged. And one of the best ways we can course what they call liver chi, okay, moving the liver energetics, is getting the blood to move through exercise, okay, hard workouts. This guy would have needed to work out very hard just to keep his mind at bay. So that would have been the one thing, very hard manual labor job, if one. I don't recommend this for a lot of people. I would have recommended a vegan or plant-based diet for him. And the reason for this is, given his proclivities to want to eat the highly sugary processed foods, I don't know how well he would have done with a more keto paleo diet. Maybe he would have done fine, like maybe he would have done fine with carnivore or those things. But, meat is a stimulating yang food. And for someone who has this much built up emotional tension on the inside, I would actually say, a vegan plant-based diet that is more what they call sattvic, I think in Ayurveda. It's a diet that actually calms and settles the mind. With someone like this, I think that would be an extreme to take. I think extremes are never great, but I think extremes at certain times are needed, and this is the kind of person that I think would have needed that. So I would have suggested a vegan or plant-based diet for him. The other thing I would have suggested and really gotten his parents to look at early on would have been something akin to craniosacral therapy, some kind of somatic body therapy that could have hopefully unwound some of the trauma that happened in his head. Treating brain injury is incredibly difficult, and nothing is a surefire method, but there are ways to, especially nowadays, but craniosacral therapy would be one of the ways that I would have suggested him to become engaged in, strictly because of the brain injuries and what happened to him. And the supplement, that could have helped in that regard as well, as lion's mane. So if you guys are not familiar with lion's mane, it's incredibly good for mental clarity and focus, but also is incredibly good for stimulating the growth of nerves. So people that have nerve damage, they've shown in studies that lion's mane can actually help, kind of carve new neural pathways. And I think for someone like him who had the brain injury, who had those really, intense injuries as a young man, as a young boy, would have been very good for him. So you guys, that's my read on Richard Ramirez. It's a sad, sad story for all of the people that died, for the life he lived. And, the lives that we get to live aren't always pretty, and this is case in point. But that's my read on Richard Ramirez, guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. If you guys would like a face reading from me, feel free to reach out to me at omnihealthandlifestyle.com. And with the context of face reading, if I do face readings for you guys, it's 75 minutes. It's a much more full rangey, expansive process. And we get to talk about all of the lifestyle pieces that would be optimal for you given the shape of your face. So thanks again, you guys. Take care.